Set rotation has the big benefit of decreasing complexity because there are physically less cards that you have to think about. But then you're still
I
stuck with all
mean,
the mechanics and the rules. But the big one to me is rulings, because not only do you have to know what the card does, and I guess you can read it during the match, but you also need to know the relevant rulings.
rulings are generally pretty broad. If you understand a ruling for one card, you can apply the same logic to another. Um, but rulings, they are super complex. It does take a couple of years to understand every ruling. And there are very few cards that have specific rulings only linked to that card specifically. There are probably less than 10 in the game, since most effects are generally not original enough. There are usually just a couple of cards that share those effects. But in terms of rulings, that is a good point. I guess you'll just have to call a judge for that. If you want to be more competitive, then you do have to know the rulings, since it does give you the better upside, and you do have judges there anyways.
This is a real big benefit of not playing in paper, playing online. You don't need to know quite so many rulings because you'll try something and then the computer will decide whether or not that's a legal position.
On something like Dueling Book, it is manual, so you do have to call a judge if you have any dispute.
But in Edo Pro, most of the time the computer will resolve it for you.
Pretty much every simulator apart from Dueling Book is automated.
Do you think Konami could introduce new players with a better simulator? I mean, obviously we have the simplified game, which is Duel Links, or any of the other variants that they've tried, but do you think that there's a good way to have access to all the cards and not get blown out of the water with people that already have more knowledge or more understanding of the game?
Perhaps if like a Konami registered simulator were to come out and you get more cards based on experience and you're only matched up against people with the same card pool, you might kind of solve that problem, since a more experienced player won't have a small amount of cards.
There is the way that Hearthstone does matches is it uses an elo system where they're looking at your rank as far as your performance over time, and then it generates a nice curve to show your expected performance, and then it overlays that curve with your opponent's curve, and looking at how much of an overlap there is to determine how high or low your ranking goes as a result. But I think that there should be another factor, which is just looking at your card pool. So in addition to matching you with someone of approximate skill level, it's also someone with approximate skill pool. But from a functional standpoint, that's a little bit difficult because in Hearthstone, the way the matches work is it looks for the greatest overlap, but as you continue to wait in the queue, it gets more lenient and more lenient. So if you wait in the queue for a full minute, you might get matched with someone that is dramatically better or dramatically worse than you just because they don't want you spending too much time in the queue.
I doubt those situations happen too often. I'd imagine they only happen very rarely. So in the once or twice it happened, you'll probably have to deal with it.
I'm weird, and I definitely value player experience really, really high when it comes to card games. And as a result, things like balance and interactive gameplay are also weighed pretty high because those contribute to player experience. But where do you stand on that?
I mean, for a game as complex as Yu-Gi-Oh, player experience is like number one priority. You're not going to start playing the game for like 10 days and then realistically understand every interaction and every single deck building like perfection. Experience plays an incredibly high role in a game like Yu-Gi-Oh. But in a more, say, simplified game with a smaller card pool and with lesser rulings and complexities, that the importance of experience definitely does reduce.
I think you could pretty easily understand what every piece does and some of the basics of movement and strategy in chess in 10 days, but it can take years before you have memorized enough of the combos or have had enough experience with Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And that's just such a high barrier to entry for new players.
You've got traps monsters, you've got fusion monsters, ritual monsters, Xyz monsters, link monsters, pendulum monsters, lots of different rulings to accompany. Like now we've got just conjunctions change the way a card functions. Whether it says also or then can play a huge role. Um, it's the game is just a lot more complex as time has gone on. Since you do need more, to say cards and more original cards. Set rotation, as you said, it won't really erase any of the complexities of synchro exes, fusion, pendulum. It won't erase any of that. Realistically, just reduce the card pool size, and I don't necessarily think it'll do much else apart from that. Card interactions and rulings will still be the same, and card specific rulings are practically non-existent. When I decided to go competitive, I knew all the fundamentals, and I realistically just had to get back in touch with the meta and understand how it worked. I didn't know too many rulings, so that was something too. But apart from that, I just realistically needed to get back in touch with the meta, so I just watched combo videos and whatnot.
One of the weirdest parts of Yu-Gi-Oh to me is this aversion to keywords, because in Magic you have bolded keywords. For example, the one that crosses over best into Yu-Gi-Oh is called Trample, and it's if your attack is greater than your opponent's defense, they take the remaining damage to their life or to their life points. And of course we have piercing battle damage, but it took 15 years to get piercing battle damage. Just that one keyword implemented into the game. Do you think that spelling out what the card does every single time is a net benefit or a net loss?
Yeah, and it just looks a lot more intimidating for a newer player. They'd rather read like three words rather than two sentences.
There is a lack of standardization. It would be a lot easier if all the cards in Yu-Gi-Oh were treated the same. If it's sent to the graveyard from the field, it doesn't really matter if it's sent or destroyed, in my opinion. That's a complicated distinction that you don't have in other card games.
Yeah, it's the individual words matter a lot more in Yu-Gi-Oh. Like discarded or sent from hand to the graveyard. Um, it can kind of get confusing sometimes. But in like something like Heart Magic or Hearthstone, I like the way they just have the keywords on there. Like they just have haste and not this card can attack the turn on your first turn or something. I don't necessarily remember the full what haste does. But in something like Hearthstone, they have battle cries, and you just say battle cry and then write down what it does instead of saying if this card is normal or special summon, you can.
Part of the problem is that Yu-Gi-Oh is in paper, so you have to write down everything, and in Hearthstone there's a bolded keyword, and then to the side it will tell you exactly what it does on every single card that it has. And there's a large part of me that thinks that maybe Yu-Gi-Oh shouldn't be a paper card game anymore. Just because of increasing complexity, but also errata. Because so many cards don't do what they say they do, and sometimes it's just problem solving text. So many old cards didn't specify whether or not they targeted because targeting effects weren't important at the time. So I still don't know if some of my cards target, and you have to look up each individual one for when it happens. Does Dark Core target? Does Tribute of the Doom target? Does Offerings to the Doom target? I don't know.
The card game back then wasn't really that sophisticated necessarily. You can kind of forgive that now that the game has become much more, say, I'll just say something like, say, posh and more refined. You kind of do need to specify, and it's kind of it's kind of a matter of monetization too. They're going to reprint the card, and if you really want to know what exactly the card does without having to go on Google, then how about you just pay 10 cents for it?
The worst part about that is that all versions of the card are still legal, to my understanding, in tournament play. So you can have your Invasion of Chaos, Chaos Emperor Dragon, but it doesn't do what the card says it does.
In that case, you probably do have to just learn what the card does. And when you said Yu-Gi-Oh shouldn't be on paper, I'm gonna have to say I was a bit surprised by that statement.
I mean, it solves a lot of problems. We're getting to that level if you know that Neuron is used in official competitive play now. So it's the software that you use for deck registration. But the other big function of Neuron is that you can pull up the new problem-solving text or any relevant errata to the card. So we're 2/3 of the way to having online tournaments, in my opinion.
I've seen a couple of like vlog type videos about people going to events, and what they kind of like most about going to events is meeting the new people, and turning into an online card game could potentially just absolutely eradicate that feature of being able to socialize with other people and make new friends playing the game.
I like the paper cards quite a lot, but I think this is one of the times where complexity and convenience are the determining factors for me. This is one segment from a longer conversation. For further discussion on the design oddities of Yu-Gi-Oh!, there is another video featuring Chuck on my channel. I generally focus on Yu-Gi-Oh!, but other card games are mentioned in comparison. Link is in both the card and the description below.